Hello everybody, my name is Tyler Valle, and I've been saying for a long time that publishers are not the friend of the gamer, and according to Metacritic, there are currently 8 major publishers out there and 17 mid-size. Out of these 25, I believe 17 have committed recent sins against their consumer base, and over half of them have continuously betrayed the trust of those that give them money. In this series, I'd like to point out these poisons to you, in hopes that when you get an itch to play that new game, you actually take a moment to consider whether or not the publisher is using your money against you. If I miss anything and you believe that should be added to this list, let me know in the comment section below and I'll try to add it as an annotation. It should be known that these are not organized by offense, rather by where they rank on the Metacritic scale. Trust me, if I were to start with whom I believe is the worst offender, we'd be here all night, and while I'd love nothing more than to whisper sweet nothings about gaming into your ear, as the sun rises over the mountains, I fear that my throat just cannot take that kind of abuse. Finally, before I begin, I'd like to mention that none of this implies that these publishers haven't done good things as well. I just think it's time that their closets are cleaned out. So without further ado, let's start cleaning. First up is Nintendo. Yeah, Nintendo. Most of us remember growing up with our Super Nintendo playing Super Mario Bros. Or Legend of Zelda. So many hours were poured into those game consoles, so what could they possibly done to end up on this list? Well, for starters, they still region log both their consoles and their games. Something that Sony ended after the PlayStation 2 and Microsoft ended a little bit later after the Xbox 360. Not only do they still region lock their consoles, they were actually the first ones to start introducing region lock in their consoles. They also been holding several of their IPs hostage, and if you disagree with that, think about this. How long have fans truly been wanting a sequel to Star Fox, Metroid, or F-Zero? And finally, Nintendo time and time again has underprinted its physical merchandise in an attempt to drive up panic and drive immediate sales. Now, 4 examples that I can think of off the top of my head are the Wii, which was sold out for months after it came out, Xenoblade, which was a GameStop exclusive localization, which now has a price tag of $94 last time I checked on Amazon, Amiibos, which have been a frenzy every time that they've released, even though Nintendo has continuously apologized and said that they will try to do better in the future, and Splatoon, which sold out on its first day in Japan, which led to Nintendo begging people to play the digital version of the game. Now, does this mean Nintendo is a bad publisher? Not necessarily, but it does mean that they have a lot of flaws. Some flaws I think a lot of Nintendo fanboys are way too willing to forgive just because they liked playing their games in the past. Now remember guys, as a consumer you have to utter the mantra, it's never okay. No, not even when Nintendo does it. Up next is Ubisoft, and oh boy, where do I even begin? Okay, so let's start off the top of my head. They've turned Assassin's Creed into a pointless cash grab, milking the series for the past nearly a decade, releasing 14 titles in the last 9 years, not including any of the mobile games. Each release, for the most part, has been more of the same, with the biggest update that I saw, while being a longtime fan of the series, being the update between Assassin's Creed and Assassin's Creed 2. Not content with this cookie-cutter formula being exclusive to Assassin's Creed, they've now started moving that into their other franchises. Now, tell me, do you really believe that Far Cry 4 wasn't just Far Cry 3 with a new coat of paint? Now, let's not forget about that horrible downgrade between Watch Dogs E3 gameplay footage and the actual release of the game. Now, while this isn't exclusive to Ubisoft, it was made doubly worse by the fact that the HD textures were found within the files of the game on PC. Presumably so they could probably sell them back as a definitive edition upgrade to the game at a later date. Does that sound too far-fetched to you? Well, according to an anonymous poster who claimed to be an ex-Ubisoft employee years ago, Yves Guillemot had this to say about PC gamers. I don't care about PC gamers because 90% of them are pirates anyway. While there is no concrete proof that this was a real employee, it really doesn't seem that far of a reach now, does it? Ubisoft has also fumbled pretty much every launch in the last 2 years. Watch Dogs, Rayman Legends, Far Cry 4, The Crew, Assassin's Creed Unity, all released with game-crippling bugs or after a pointless series of delays in the case of Rayman Legends. While this would be unacceptable coming from a small indie developer to continuously flub every release of your games, it is absolutely disgusting seeing it come from a AAA developer who's also a publisher of its own titles. Ubisoft also began using a clunky, broken mess of a DRM called Uplay, which has upset many of its PC audience, but once again, they don't care about PC. They've admitted this. So with all these things considered, do you think Ubisoft is a good publisher? If not, are you still going to keep buying their games? And finally for today, probably the longest one on this list, Electronic Arts. So EA is guilty of pretty much everything, and if you want specifics, I can do it, but it's going to take a while. Let's start from the beginning and EA's worst offense out of all of them. EA has frequently purchased, bastardized, and inevitably liquidized good companies and good IPs. So let's start with some examples. Danger Close Games, who made the Medal of Honor franchise, Command & Conquer 3 plus its expansions, and Command & Conquer Red Alert 3 and its expansions, and Battle for Middle-earth 2. And on a personal note, they also created the Small Soldiers game for the original PlayStation, which I spent hours playing as a kid. This studio was originally founded as DreamWorks Interactive back in 1995. It was purchased by EA in 2000 and closed in 2013. Now, 13 years may not sound like a bad run, so why is it EA's fault? Well, EA were the main pushers for Medal of Honor to become another bland, repetitive, first-person shooter set during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, thus turning a beloved, albeit underperforming, World War II shooter into just another game for the pile in an attempt to create a second franchise to go up toe-to-toe against Call of Duty. Couple that with a limited budget and development time and having to compete within your own company against Battlefield, you have a recipe for disaster, and after Medal of Honor Warfighter, the company was closed soon after. That's just one, do you want to hear more? Okay, let's just go down this list. Westwood Studios spent its first 10 years making mostly movie tie-in games until 1995 when they created the original Command & Conquer. They were founded in 1985 and purchased in 1998 and were closed 5 years later. How about Mythic, best known for the MMOs Dragon's Gate back in 1985, Dark Age of Camelot, and Warhammer Online. They were founded technically in 1985, but didn't go by the name Mythic until 1995. They were purchased in 2006 and were part of a restructuring involving BioWare on June 24th, 2009, and then once again were part of a massive restructuring and team reducement November of the same year, this being a year after they released Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning. Therefore, they did not have the manpower to continue to produce that game along with an expansion, which was also supposed to be a standalone free-to-play title, on top of the other games that they had now taken over, including Ultima Online after the closure of Origin Studios. But don't worry, we'll get to that one. The last title in Mythic's name was a mobile Dungeon Keeper abomination, but again, we'll also come back to that. The biggest part of this tragedy was the fact that before its purchase to EA Games, Mythic was part of the Deloitte Technology 500's list of fastest growing by revenue tech companies in North America from 2002 up until 2006, where it was purchased by Electronic Arts. Now here's one that is going to really upset a lot of fans. Bullfrog Production, best known for the first two Dungeon Keeper games, the theme games, and the Syndicate games. They were originally founded in 1987 by Les Egger and Peter Molyneux. Yes, the mastermind behind Black and White and Fable. This studio was purchased by Electronic Arts in 1995 and was shut down in 2001. It was shut down a year after the cancellation of Dungeon Keeper 3. The closure of Bullfrog is still something that you could bring up to upset a lot of Dungeon Keeper fans. But what is so much worse is that in 2013, EA tried to bank off these fans with one of the most abusive pay-to-win games ever created. In 2013, the also now dead studio of Mythic released an iOS title called Dungeon Keeper. They claimed it was going to be a twisted take, quote-unquote, on the Dungeon Keeper series, and twisted it was. It was released to overwhelming negative reviews due to its overuse of microtransactions. This was a game that was billed as a free-to-play game, but that was a lie. The game wasn't even buy-to-play. The game was pay to keep playing, and to pay, and to pay, and to pay, just to get a little bit of gameplay, a little bit of gameplay, and a little bit of gameplay. This game wouldn't just mark the final nail in the coffin for Mythic, it would also be the last shred of respect EA held for Bullfrog's legacy thrown out the window as a simple cash grab. Just a few more, I promise. Pandemic Studios, best known for Star Wars Battlefronts 1 and 2, the Mercenary games, the first two Destroy All Humans games, and the Saboteur, which I actually really liked. They were founded in 1998 and purchased by EA in 2007, and were shut down 2 years later, after its final 3 products were cancelled. Maxis. Now this is one of the most surprising on this list. They're most known for their sim games, the SimCity games, The Sims, and Spore. They were founded in 1987 by Jeff Brown and Will Wright and purchased in 1997 and closed in 2015 after The Sims 4 didn't live up to expectations. Maxis may be the victims of EA's biggest sin in my opinion. The 3 major strikes that were held against the ruined Maxis were the butchering of Will Wright's dream game Spore by limiting its budget and pushing it out the door before it was even near completion just to meet a deadline. This also would mark when Will Wright would leave the major gaming studios and would go on to work in robotics, due to EA butchering everything that he had worked towards and wanted to work with. Not only being content with that, they actually ruined SimCity later, but we'll get to that, don't worry. The second strike was the removal of features in Sims 3 and 4 to later be sold as DLC. Now, do you want to go play Sims 3 on Steam? Well, don't worry, you can. It'll only cost you $20. But do you want to get all that DLC? Well, that's going to cost you an extra $376. Now, this is even taking into consideration that Sims 4 had even less features in its base game in comparison to Sims 3. You weren't even able to build a pool when the game first launched. This, to even the most brain-dead fans of Sims, was definitely seen as a horrible cash grab. That's still only 2 strikes. The third and final strike that put Maxis on life support was the EA demanded always online requirement for SimCity, which led to many not even being able to play the game so that they could properly review it before it even came out, let alone the fans who spent $60 on this title and could not play it for several days after its release. Even Will Wright had to come in and say that it is absolutely distasteful that these people spent $60 but could not play the game. Take into consideration that this was a year after the launch of Diablo 3, meaning that EA and Maxis knew full well what the consequences of a stupid always online requirement would be. It was sad to say that they actually didn't even remove the always online requirement until nearly a year later and 10 updates later, 8 of which were released in the first 2 months of the game's lifespan to keep it from completely dying, because people were realizing that they could either go back and play SimCity 2000 or wait until smaller studios like those that made City Skylines would come out with a game much, much better just a few years after, and it would also be cheaper and more entertaining. After these failings, Maxis was put on life support until March of this year, when its doors finally closed and its staff was restructured into the inside belly of EA. And finally, Origin Systems. Most well known for the greatest RPG series of all time, Ultima, along with the Wing Commander series. They were founded in 1983 by Robert Garriott and Richard Garriott, the latter also known as Lord British. They were purchased by EA in 1992, and the effects were immediately felt on their entire lineup of games, but in no more was it felt than in the Ultima series. It was so bad that Ultima 7 had to be split into 2 separate games so that they could make money off it, and Ultima 8 was an unfinished mess that was released early, and let's not even talk about that last one. Instead, I'll leave it up to the biggest Ultima fan I know to properly explain the rise and the fall of the entire series at the hands of EA Games. You guys can go check it out. I'll put a link in the description below to Spoonie's Ultima playlist. It's one of the most interesting and entertaining watches you could ever watch, and you could truly see why Ultima was awe-inspiring and to this day influences games in ways that you may not even realize. To their credit, EA did do one thing right, and that was creating Ultima Online back in 1997, but not being content with actually doing the right thing. To make Ultima Online continue to work, they actually had to take money out of the budget of Ultima 9 to get Ultima Online to work and continue to be funded properly. Origin hobbled on, surviving pretty much on Ultima Online entirely until 2004, when they were shut down. Origin Systems is survived by EA's digital platform of the same name and Ultima Online, the longest running MMORPG of all time. All of these companies had great past and had bright futures ahead of them until EA Games sunk their claws into them. So when EA buys your studio, it's not a matter of if you'll survive, it's how long do you have left. Outside of that, EA were also the studio that popularized Day 1 DLC being a norm within the industry, and most annoyingly of all, they tried and failed with the stupid online pass bullshit so that they could skim a little bit off the top of used game sales. With all these things considered, is EA a bad publisher? Well, I'm willing to go on record and say that EA is definitely not consumer friendly or developer friendly, but does that make them a bad publisher? And with that, we've come to the end of the first episode of this series. Come back next time to see me take on more publishers on our list, and until then, my name is Tyler Valle of GamesNotch, and you guys have a great day.